We'll begin in just a sec, but before we do, this will be like a play along section. There'll be some exercises that you can do on your computer. So it's important that you have the whole toolkit, all the software. So you can find all of a link to all of the software that you'll need is at this URL. And if you did your homework in the packet before this conference, actually you don't quite have everything you need because I did a late addition. So in addition to maybe what you've done previously, if you don't have the use this package in R, please go ahead and install it. And that'll allow you to run this line of code in RStudio at the console, which will basically download to your machine all of the exercises that we're going to use today. So I'll give you a minute or two to do that, and I'll just kind of walk around and see how folks are doing. And just as a sanity check, for the first person that's able to actually open a new RStudio project and you see all of the exercise files, please raise your hand just for me to know that actually this whole workflow does work, because you're the first people testing it. Yeah, so one thing to note is when you run this line of R code, it'll prompt you twice, basically asking if you trust me because you're downloading my files. So agree twice, and then it'll drop you into a new RStudio project with all the exercises. All right, so it looks like most of you are looking at a screen that looks, I don't know, something, well, actually, I think I have my windows rearranged a little bit, but if you click into the file side, you'll know you're in the right spot if you see this. If you weren't able to get this working, there's a workaround. Everything for this workshop can be found on this website. So if you click that link, it'll take you to this website, and this will, be up after this next hour and a half. It actually has way more materials than we're going to get through in the next hour and a half, but it has a link off to what's the easiest way to do it? Probably this way. Well, that is broken. All right, because I changed this. What is the easiest way to get to this? Oh man. Maybe this. There we go. So all of the materials for this workshop are built using Quarto, the slides, the website, your exercises. So if you weren't able to download the QMDs, you can click on that link in the upper left, brings you to GitHub. And if you go back one into the repositories here, there are two repositories in this organization. One of them is exercises. And that line of code that you just all ran in R basically grabbed all this stuff, dumped it onto your machine, and opened it up as an RStudio project. So if you weren't able to download those and open them, you can always just go to code, download zip, and then it's just a good old-fashioned zip file. You can open it up and take a look at all these QMD files. All right. So let's see. Go ahead and get started. All right, so hello. My name is Andrew Bray. I'm an associate teaching professor here in the statistics department. I've used R Markdown for 10 years or so, and Quarto for a year and change, which is to say just about as long as it's been around. Can you raise your hand if you've used R Markdown before? Okay, most of you have. So if you have, this will all look very familiar. If you haven't, hopefully this will be a eye-opening experience. There's been, over the past 10 years, just an amazing golden age of scientific publishing that's been happening in the R Markdown ecosystem that now is accessible to people outside of R because of Quarto. So it's really exciting, and I'm always interested to learn from practicing scientists, like what your workflows are, what your data is, what your analysis is, and the sorts of publishing that you're interested to do. So hopefully we'll have a chance to chat a bit afterwards so I can learn about the projects you're working on. All right, so this workshop is generally pitched at somebody who knows some R. If you don't know R, you'll still get, I think, quite a bit out of this workshop. Has worked in RStudio. So, this is the IDE, the Integrated Development Environment that we'll use to write our Quarto documents. If you haven't worked in RStudio before, you don't know your way around all of the menus, that's also okay. You'll just be doing more kind of watching and not so much coding. And then, that you want to learn about Quarto. I'll teach you some stuff about Quarto syntax, the formats of the files that you can create. Since most of you have had some experience with Markdown, maybe we can go quickly through that. And maybe you'll learn something about R in addition. Okay, so generally the way that these workshops work is there's certain things that are going to be like lecture segments when I'm talking over slides like this. There's going to be other times when I'm just live coding. There can be, times as I'm live coding, you're welcome to kind of code along with me, tinker with things. And then there'll be a few of these, like, here's 7 minutes, here's an exercise, see if you can tinker around with these tasks. And during those, Fernando and I'll circulate. All right, so just to be sure, before we embark, these were kind of, you need our R, you need RStudio, you need Quarto, and some R packages, and then this just brings in the exercises for the play along component. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So what is Quarto? Well, you can think about this as a new open source scientific technical publishing system, and it aims to make the process of creating and collaborating dramatically better. So we're taking not just R actually, but Python, Julia, and actually all sorts of other like computational languages, Observable JS, Mermaid, Dot, Shiny, all sorts of software that you can embed in all sorts of different published documents. So PDFs, HTMLs, Word documents, websites, Beamer slides, HTML slides, you can put it in your blog. And the idea is that like your source for all of your documents that contains your code, that contains your writing, can now just always stay in one format, a QMD file. And then you can just kind of change out code as you need to change out code, change out the publishing venue as that changes, like, I want this as a blog post. So now I'm reworking it into a manuscript. Oh, now I'm turning it into a slide presentation. You can, actually, I did that to prepare this, just literally copying and pasting from one document type to another document type. It's extremely flexible. So yeah, you can weave together narrative text, code to produce elegantly formatted output, documents, web pages, blog posts, books, and more. That's pretty much just like Markdown. And in fact, I'd say like 90% of the 80% of the functionality that we're seeing today, 85, you can do completely in R Markdown, including using Python, using Julia. But the problem is, or one of the issues is that you still have to be running R to do that. So you're running R to run the Python to make your document. With Quarto, if you don't want to use R at all, if you're working with a team that's 100% Python or 100% Julia, they won't have to touch R. All right, so yeah, there's more to it. You can think about this as Quarto. It unifies the existing R Markdown ecosystem and also is extending it. And you know, for me, this has been a godsend. I have loved using the R Markdown ecosystem. I teach my courses. The course website was using the blog down package. My slides were using the sharing in package. I would use the R Markdown package to make assignments, handouts, exams. And they were great, but they were all developed by different people. Like that's the classic, you know, R package ecosystem is anybody can contribute a package, but there was never an overall architecture that was really defined for what R Markdown, how stuff should operate. So one of the huge benefits if you're an existing R Markdown user of shifting to Quarto is that now just the architecture makes sense. Like file paths all take the same format. The YAML always takes the same format, kind of the meta information. So it's much better organized. So we get consistent implementation of attractive, handy features. These are things like tab sets, code folding, syntax highlighting. Those used to be, they were all available previously, but now they're just completely consistent. It better supports accessibility. This is something that like I've had a very enlightening experience this semester because I'm teaching a student who's 100% blind. And this is a statistics course that he's in where we are coding in our studio, including doing data visualizations. And this, you know, it's just been, yeah, enlightening to think through how somebody like that can navigate materials. And I learned that actually I got lots of accessibility for free just by working with Quarto. We ran the course website, which is built with Quarto, through one of these assessment tools that tells you how accessible it is. And it automatically was like kind of flying colors. So it supports accessibility really well. It also has great support for any language, kind of equivalent support. R is not the first class citizen that it is in the R Markdown ecosystem. They're all equal players. Okay, so just to start, I want to give you just a tour of how Quarto works. This will just take like 3 minutes. I'm just gonna zip through a couple things. And so yeah, I just say, go ahead and sit back and enjoy. All right, so I'm gonna go inside this, open up a Quarto file. So on the left here, put this way, we have the QMD source file. And this is written primarily in Markdown. We can see some code here. And I'm going to go ahead and render it. So I'm going to do that by clicking the render button. It's going to process for a little moment. Then it's going to display it. I have it display it within our studio on the right-hand side here. And we see a nice HTML document that renders this double hashtag as a header. The code shows up this way. We can get some figures. We can get a nicely printed data frame. So that's terrific. But what if, this is an HTML file. And what if I wanted to print it? Well, all I have to do is change this to PDF and re-render. And wait a moment for LaTeX to do its black magic. And now we have a kind of equivalent representation of all of this, still running the code, putting the artifacts into this PDF document. But maybe I'm working with a colleague that is really into Microsoft Word. So I need to use, and my computer's like, where is Microsoft? Do I even have Microsoft Word? I generally don't use it, but plenty of people do. Oh, there it is. Okay, so yeah. So here it is as a Word file, a docx. And you can see like there's small aesthetic changes, but substantively, we get the same thing from the same source. So I don't have to keep rewriting documents. My source lives just in one place. Okay, so that's kind of straightforward. If you've used our Markdown, you're like, yeah, I've been doing this for years. But you haven't been doing this for years. So what about Reveal.js? Has anybody used Reveal.js before? This is Reveal.js. It is a slide deck now. An HTML slide deck. I can pop this out if I want. And where did it pop out? There it is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, if we look inside here, all it did was take those level 2 headers and it's like, okay, that defines the next slide. And it has lots of very sensible defaults. Okay, so maybe you're working with somebody. Does anybody use Beamer for their slides? Oh gosh, gluttons for punishment. So yeah, Beamer's it's really helpful if you're putting tons of tech and mathematics into your presentations. It outputs in PDF, which is nice. But there we have a Beamer presentation. So it's extremely flexible. But what I've shown you just now is examples of taking a single QMD file, source file, and rendering, well, several different types of polished single documents, either static documents or slideshows in a couple different formats. You can also do PowerPoint. Actually, you can do, I think there's 144 different output formats. So like if it exists, it's probably possible to just render your document to that type. But you can also compose with Quarto multiple QMD documents into a larger project. And a good example of what a larger project is a website. Like each page on a website, you can think about as an HTML file that could be generated by its own dedicated QMD file. So I'm going to see if I can go ahead and pull that together. Since I'm making a website, this is going to be an HTML file again. I'm going to get rid of all this junk that I put together. Keep the source around. All right, and if you've ever made a website before, you're familiar with the fact that the home page is called the index. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new Quarto document, just kind of using the blank stuff here. Clear out all the boilerplate and say, welcome to my website. That's going to be my home page. My website, lamest name ever. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this as the index. So, oops, I save this back here. Let me move it next door. There we go. So now I have 2 QMD files, and that's like 2 web pages in a website, but I need to give it a little bit more information to know kind of how to set up the website, how to navigate between these two different files. So I have this text file that has some of that information represented in YAML format. So all I'm saying here is that, okay, this is going to be a Quarto project of type website, and then I can just start supplying some information. What did I call this? My website. And then I'm saying I'd like a nav bar. That's a kind of menu bar across the top. And on the left side, we're going to have something called home that links off to index.qmd. And then the second one is just going to point towards that hellopenguins.qmd and pull the title in from that document. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And the magic happens when I rename this as underscore quarto.yml. So letting Quarto know, what you see inside this directory is a Quarto project, specifically a website. So now I can call Quarto here at the command line and just say, let's see, cd tour. So now I'm there. I'm just going to call Quarto render. Notice that it's rendering one of two. So it renders the first document, renders the second document, and it says, output is created inside site. So I click inside this, and I have a website. So that's my index.qmd. I can click into Hello Penguins, and we have that page. Right, yeah, the tour bit I just kind of added afterwards, yeah. Yeah, there's plenty of information about websites in the additional materials part of this website. Yeah, so you can do all sorts of really sophisticated websites. I mean, the website for this workshop is just QMD files. The course that I'm teaching right now is Introduction to Probability and Statistics. This is all built with Quarto files. It's a flip style class, so students read lecture notes instead of going to hear me lecture. And this is published as a blog. So like, here's the entry on the grammar of graphics. Just kind of goes through this. And then in class, we have slides for this day where we go through the grammar of graphics. And everything that you see here is all artifacts of Quarto documents. All right, so that is the whirlwind tour of just something that you can do, some of the things you can do with Quarto. Yeah. I think there are two acronyms. One is yet another markup language. I think that's right. Yeah, it's just, yeah, it's a way that you can represent kind of I think about it as if you're an R user, data frames are well represented in flat files as CSV files, and lists in R are well represented either as JSON files, or if you want it to be more readable, as a YAML file. So it's kind of an easier editable way to edit kind of configuration files and whatnot. Yeah, we'll talk about those in just a sec. All right, so now it's your turn. So inside your exercise, you should see hellopenguins.qmd. Oh yeah, one thing I want to show you is the visual editor real quick. Sorry, before I dump you into this. So I'm really accustomed to working, just looking at the actual markdown here. So if you're an R Markdown user and used to that, go for that. I know of many people that prefer, including seasoned R Markdown users that prefer to use this visual editor mode. So the visual editor mode, you can actually edit this, and it's much closer the interface to working in a Word document. So for example, if I want to bold something, here I can just select it and click bold. And I can click back to source, and it does the relevant Markdown editing. Yeah. So if you've hated using Markdown in the past, writing Markdown by hand, you can just do it here in the visual editor. And so you can do all sorts of, like, making your lists, yeah, it pretty much looks like Word now. So with that, using either the visual or the source editor, whatever you prefer, please render the document, update your name and re-render. So let me show you, I realize I left that out, where to put the name. You can add a field here called author. I should have added that to begin with. So if you add author Andrew Bray and click render, oops, it's still rendering in the website. Let me get rid of my Quarto file. Okay, I'll go back to the exercise one that you have. There we go. So yeah, I would say just go ahead and tinker with this a bit. Try maybe adding some more text. You could try adding some more headers, those double hashtags. And if you're in the visual editor, you can kind of just go to town, like tinkering with the different buttons as if it were Word, and then flipping over to the source editor and seeing how it responds. I'll give you like 5 minutes for this, since many of you already have some experience with our Markdown. This is a terrific R package called Countdown. Yeah. All right. How about we move on? If you're, running into a bug with one component or don't quite understand why something is behaving the way that it is, we might answer your question in the coming sections here. All right, so what exactly is Quarto? It's not an R package, is the big change. It's a command line interface tool. So it's something that you can download from quarto.org independently of any computing language, actually. You don't need Python, R, Julia to run it or anything. It's kind of an independent standalone piece of software that you can use if you've used Git from the command line before, you can kind of use Quarto in a similar way. So this is, if I were to go, like I have a Mac here, so if I go into the terminal, I get the command line prompt. And if I were to type in Quarto space -- help, that's calling the help command within Quarto, and it prints out this sort of information. So we can see, like now we're on version 1.3. It tells me here the other sorts of arguments that I can give, just basic Quarto. I can ask for help or I can ask for the version. It also tells me all the different kind of commands that Quarto has. And it's actually a pretty simple piece of software. It just has like 15 different commands that you can give it. So Quarto render, Quarto preview, Quarto serve. And if you want, you can run Quarto from the command line. I sometimes do. I'd say, yes, sometimes I'm typing in the command line. Often I just use the RStudio hotkey to render in the same way that you would knit an RMD document previously. So yeah, here's the preview command. But it's, what it's doing here is it's kind of like knitr, but it's actually more than knitr. So if you think about knitr itself, knitr is an R package, and what it does is it takes a source file, either an RMD or a QMD, and it combs through it, and it looks for R code. Actually, it can look for any type of code, but now it's specifically, in Quarto, it just looks for R code, and it pulls out that R code, and it runs it, and it stores all the artifacts, the figures, or the output, or the model, or whatnot. And then what Quarto does is it stitches that together into a markdown document. And then from that markdown document that has all the computational outputs from knitr, it then runs it through Pandoc, another command line tool that was actually developed here at Berkeley. Pandoc's the one that's doing all the magical formatting. So, when you're spinning it to a PDF or a PowerPoint or a Beamer or Reveal, that's actually at that point Pandoc doing the work. So you can kind of think about Quarto as a computational wrapper for Pandoc. Pandoc is the universal document converter. It allows you to go from one type to another. And Quarto just kind of allows your source documents to include computation, and it kind of orchestrates how that computation runs and how the artifacts of that computation should be woven into the output. Quarto also uses Jupyter. So is anybody a Jupyter user? Is it in the form of Jupyter notebooks or? Okay, VS Code. And you use? Gotcha. Okay. So, Jupyter can do lots of things. Most people think of the Jupyter notebook, but Jupyter can also basically do what knitr is doing. They have similar roles in that they know how to run code cells. And Jupyter is used to running them from a Jupyter notebook, but it can also run the code cells that are coming out of a Quarto document. So because there's lots of machinery there to process Python code and Julia code, basically if your Quarto document contains R code, it's going to use knitr to run all the R code. If it contains Python code or Julia code, Jupyter is going to do all of the formatting. And like at the moment, our knitr has you have a little bit finer control over how you execute your code. If it's R, then Python. But that's just because Knitter kind of has more control than Jupyter does. But they'll probably start balancing out, and all of the most important functionality is available to all three languages. I should say you can also like skip a QMD altogether. So if you have colleagues that are used to working in .ipynbs files instead of QMD files, you can use that as the source file for kind of any of the sort of outputs that I just showed you. You can make a reveal.js HTML slide deck from a Jupyter notebook. And you can also, one of these commands actually, right here, it's one of my favorites, Quarto convert. Convert documents to alternate representations. I use this to go back and forth between QMD and IPYNB because my brain just cannot think in terms of Jupyter notebooks. Like having to keep the output and the input in the same document is just like antithetical to the way that I think about computing. But I work with plenty of people that are totally successful in that format. So they can work in their IPYNB, they send it to me, I Quarto convert it to a QMD file, work on it, and then convert it back to an IPYNB and send it back to them. So Quarto plays really well with Jupyter notebooks. Right, okay. Yeah, let's skip this bit about Lua. We have a VS Code user, that's perfectly fine. I use RStudio most often, and RStudio has great support for Quarto. There's equivalent support, or not quite equivalent, there's really good support within Jupyter Lab. If you use that as your IDE, but actually really good support within VS Code. So you don't need to use RStudio to use all these tools. Okay, so if you're in RStudio, how does this work? Well, you have this document, you can render it just by pushing the render button. I think that's the main one that I've been doing. You can also go over to your terminal, either within RStudio or open up a new terminal and just say Quarto render hello-penguins.qmd. It's going to do the same thing. And I'll dump the output file right next to wherever the source file is. If you want to change the format from the command line, you can, just by saying, now send it to PDF or to docx. So you could do that if you didn't want to go back into the file and change the format : HTML. And there's also, it's kind of confusing, there's an R package that wraps Quarto. So you can render your documents within R using Quarto. And this does have a use case, but I want you to tinker around with this a little bit. So open, or you probably still have that QMD file, and try a couple of different things. So try doing RStudio render, try going to your terminal and doing Quarto render space, the name of the file. And then in your console, which is say at the little R prompt, try running inside the Quarto package, Quarto render, then give it a string that's the name of your file. Try tinkering with 3 different ways that you could render a document. And yeah, if you're an RStudio user, I'll ask you afterwards why the other 2 methods might be helpful. Yep. Yes. Actually, there's. Yeah, let me go back to that. There's a great hotkey if you're on these slides right now. Yeah, raise your hand if you have the slides open. Yeah, that could be really handy. Let me give you the URL. So you might want to send a browser tab to andrew.quartopub/rt2-quarto. That bit will get you to the website with all the materials. And then you can have up the slides alongside. And one neat thing, these are reveal slides, is you can press O and you get an overview of your slide deck. So it's for really quick navigation. So we're going back, say here. You also have a table of contents, so you can go through the menu also. Oops. Say again? To the website, yes. Yeah, this will be helpful to have this guy. Mm-hmm.
For the website.
Yeah, Quarto RT2, you just have it backwards. I should have started with this. What?
The link was the other way around. And there was
Yeah.
something.
Oh, was it?
And
Yeah.
and there is a last part that we couldn't get. RT2 portal and something else.
That not work. Yeah. Oh, it is backwards. Whoops. Sorry about that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just demonstrate these three. Let's see. So, well, the first is straightforward enough. I just click the button. And to be honest, this is normally, like, it's very common that I just do it this way. Oh, darn it, this is the wrong one. That's my website one. Here we go. So that's one way, through our studio. Way two is through the terminal. So my terminal window is up here. But I could also on a Mac just type terminal like this, and then in this little guy, just be sure it's over in the right directory, and then call this exact same function, which is Quarto render hello penguins.html. Before I do this, let's delete. Here's that HTML file. Delete. Yes, that was the one that I made through the render button. I'm going to try it just using the command line tool. And, oh, right, .html, there's no HTML file. There is a QMD file. And where, oops, inside tour. So I'll put it, yeah, let me cd, oops. Keep rendering the wrong one. Okay. There we go. So I can get a QMD file that way. And then the third way is flipping over here to R. So now I'm talking to R. And inside the Quarto package, there's a Quarto render. And I just give it the name as a string, hello penguins.qmd. And if you watch the time here, well, maybe I did it within the same minute, but I can do it 3 different ways. Can anybody think through why these different ways would be useful? Like hitting the button straightforward enough. When would you want, like, to be able to run it at the terminal? When would you want to be able to run it at the console in R? Has anybody come across a use case for these? Exactly. So you can imagine that you have an R script that does all sorts of different things. One of which is you want it at the end to render your document. So maybe you just have some scripts that do some file cleaning, take raw data, get process data, and that process data is what your QMD file is reading in. You could just encode that all or write that all up as a .r file, the bottom of which is this Quarto render within R. So yeah, totally. That's a good reason to use the R package. The terminal thing, I use it for continuous integration. So this is something when I'm not the one that's rendering my document, but instead I'm using GitHub, for example. They have computers that you can use, like cloud-based computers, to render your documents. So my website, for example, I never actually render it on my machine. I just send code up to GitHub, and GitHub will automatically run Quarto render and publish my website. And it's on Unix, this machine that GitHub's using, that I can just send it kind of, command line command. So I just use the Quarto render at the command line interface for continuous integration that way. Yeah, all right. So formats. So when you get Quarto, when you download it, you get like the ability to render all sorts of different things. We saw lots of these. I guess I didn't show you PowerPoint. You can do PowerPoint. I don't know if you can do Google Slides. Should look into that. And this is all regardless of the language that you're using. So same thing for Python or R. There are many, many, many output formats. These are all links in these slides. So if you want to read about them, you can click on the links in the slides. One that I just want to highlight right here, because we might not get to it, is this Quarto article layout. So Quarto journal articles, I'll just do it this way. So has anybody ever written a manuscript that you've submitted to a journal using an R Markdown file? What about using a tech file? Okay, so within R, there's an articles package that has tons of different journal formats where you can do your authoring in an RMD file and then render to PDF or whatever, or even tech, whatever they need. Quarto is starting to do the same thing, so allow you to kind of author your manuscripts within Quarto. So yeah, Elsevier has a ton of journals. The ASA, this is what the ASA format is. This is a PDF using their exact thing, and this was all produced using a Quarto document. Let's take a look at some of these. PLOS, what does PLOS look like? Yeah, very different. But so these are really kind of richly formatted PDFs of the sort that maybe you're used to, you need to use tech to do that. You really can use either RMDs or QMDs to produce these. And then, the main advantage as I see it is I find tech to be, there's lots of markup relative to the amount of content in a tech file. And a QMD file or an RMD file is like the most output agnostic way to author anything. So it kind of future-proofs your work, so you don't have to keep changing formats. All right. Now where did my slides go? I need a separate, way too many tabs open. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, let's see how we're doing on time. Yeah. Let's go ahead and skip this one in the interest of time. You're welcome to kind of do it on your own time. But just to wrap up, we have lots of R Markdown users. If you're wondering okay, great, did this just invalidate all of my RMD files? Not at all. There's still plenty of functionality in the R Markdown ecosystem that hasn't yet been ported to Quarto. I wouldn't say plenty. I would say right tail power user R Markdown stuff that hasn't yet made its way into Quarto. So you really can only do that stuff within R Markdown now. But you really can just turn them into Quarto documents by changing the extension to that QMD. There's backwards compatibility, but our Markdown continues to be maintained as a format. But the development now is happening in Quarto, so you can just watch the repo on GitHub. There are commits are flying fast and furious. Features are getting added very regular basis versus RMD's kind of more or less flatlining. It's still adding some new features. In fact, the author of the knitter package is still primarily working in the R Markdown ecosystem, but you have a whole team of developers that's working on Quarto now. Yes. Yeah, so before we wrap up kind of this intro bit, any questions? Yeah.
Any way that they collaborate on nothing at the same time with that team project?
Yes. So there's a couple different ways that this can happen. So that's more collaborating on the same document. Actually that doesn't have to do with Quarto. It has to do basically with RStudio. Where are you editing the text file? And is that software, does it permit other people to log in and kind of work on the same document? And so you actually can do that. One way that you can do it in RStudio is if you're running RStudio server. So RStudio server is what we use in my intro stats class. So it's just browser-based RStudio. Looks the exact same as if you're running it locally, but you can set it up to have shared projects so that multiple people can log in at the same time. And it just is like a Google Doc. You can see each other's cursors. So in fact, you've been able to do that since about 2015 using our studio server. And I'm not really sure why, but not that many people ended up using it. Jupyter Hub, which is kind of somewhat analog. It's kind of a superset of cloud computing to what our studio can do. Had just developed a collaborative editing feature across notebooks, but it should also work across QMD files. Something that neither IDE allows at the moment is commenting. And I'm pretty sure that at what's now the POSIT conference in September, like my money would be on that being one of the big reveals, is that basically like Google Docs for Quarto for Google, whatever it is, like both collaborative editing and commenting, because it's specifically that commenting thing that really no other platform has done anywhere near as good as Google Docs. And people, like lots of people use it. So both Jupyter, the project, and Quarto have been getting lots of feature requests, like allow for both collaboration and commenting. So they're both working on it. Yeah, that's exactly the workflow that they're working on. Because currently it's exactly as you described. It's like, I'm going to do my fun stuff over here, but I'm going to send out this kind of sanitized doc file back and forth. But yeah, it's exactly that. There's kind of just this divide among scientists of those that use kind of computational tools and script-based tools and those that don't. And there's so much development time that's gone into Word, Google Docs, track changes, all that stuff to enable collaboration. In fact, it's better functionality than what we have in kind of our neighborhood. But yeah, definitely the people working on this stuff know that is a big barrier. So they're working to remove it. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's like a quartodocs.org or something that is a Google Docs where just everybody can go in, or it's similar to Overleaf, where everybody can just be looking at the same doc, and it's the equivalent of rendered in the visual editor, probably, because that looks a lot more like Word, and with track changes on the side. So yeah, the future is coming, and it's going to be amazing. Yeah. Any other questions before we get into phase 2? All right. We have what? No, we don't have that much time, actually. One last thing before I conclude this. Where's the name Quarto come from? Does anybody recognize that name from like 12th grade English class? If you went to 12th grade in California? Hmm. So there are, I think, are 3 names that are important to keep straight. R is the computer language. It's the equivalent of Python. You can write R without knowing anything about our Studio or POSIT or Quarto or our Markdown. R existed way before all this stuff. Our Studio has been historically both the name of this software program that allows you to write R. So basically, that more or less is R right there, the computer language. And our Studio is this thing that helps you write and run R code. It was also the name of the company that built this software and lots of open source R packages. And for a while, that's been confusing to just about everybody that the company and the product, one of the products, has the same name, our Studio. So they renamed POSIT. So the company is POSIT. The IDE, where you write your R code, is RStudio, and R itself is just the language. Exactly. Yep. That's all that's changed. So like the conference that they organize is no longer called the RStudio conference, it's called the POSIT conference. And this was announced at the last RStudio conference. Yeah, it was funny, the last RStudio conference, it started like everybody went thinking that they're going to the RStudio conference, and by the end, they're like, thank you for coming to the POSIT conference. Because that was when the company changed their name. And they also basically just, part of this naming is they're pivoting, not pivoting. They are now working in Python 2. So they actually have RStudio POSIT employees who are now full-time Python developers, versus it used to be they would only develop for R. And yeah, there's a couple different, they're still totally, most of their developers are still developing in R, but they do have teams that are working in Python now. Okay, so the answer here, Quarto, comes from this like, I don't know, like I remember in Shakespeare, like English 12th grade, we'd talk about, oh, this is the Quarto version, this is the folio version of Midsummer Night's Dream. It's like a really old format of printing books where they're basically 4 to a page. And so kind of Quarto is a publishing tool. It's like, you know, they want to be like scientific printing press-ish sort of thing. All right, so I'll say that what we just got through in an hour and change was originally slated to take an hour and a half, so we've saved some time there. Really, these 4 sections are the 4 sections that a colleague and I, Mina, developed for an ASA, American Statistical Association, traveling workshop on Quarto that lasts 6 hours. So that's an hour and a half section, that's an hour and a half section, that's an hour and a half section, that's an hour and a half section. So like today, we're not going to talk about making cool Reveal.js slides or making websites. You're welcome to kind of click through those materials. But we will talk a little bit more about what actually can go into a QMD file, like understanding all of the features. All right, so what lives in a Quarto document in a QMD file? There are 3 things. There's metadata, there's text, and there's code. And the metadata, it's kind of telling information about how to render the document. Maybe it's author, maybe it's date. And it's all going to be stored as YAML. The text is going to be written using Markdown. It's a very lightweight markup of just writing plain text. And then the code we'll see can be written in lots of different languages. And it's just demarcated using these 3 tick marks. So here's the Quarto document. At the top, we have the YAML, which is in the header. So anytime in a Quarto document, you have hyphen, 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 and then another hyphen below, anything inside that, it's going to try to interpret as metadata to inform how it's going to render the document. Interesting fact about both Quarto actually and RMD files is this doesn't need to live at the top of the document. And you can have more than one. I just learned this a couple months ago. So you could have some, you know, YAML there. You could have another YAML chunk down here, another YAML chunk down here. There's some like niche use cases where you can do really cool stuff by splitting up your metadata. What we have here is the text rendered in Markdown. So here we just have a plain text. Here, by putting the 2 hashtags, we get a level 2 header. And then here we have a code cell that's demarcated by 3 backticks, which is the button, at least on my computer, that's below the escape key, and that I don't use for anything else besides code cells in Quarto and our Markdown. Okay, so yeah, metadata, just a quick discussion about this. Okay, that's the answer to your question. Yet another markup language, or YAML ain't markup language. Nice, meta. So this is used to provide that document level metadata. the general structure is key value pairs. So key is kind of like, what are you specifying? And the value is what is the value that it's going to take? So an example is when you're specifying the output option. So the key is format and the output is something HTML, PDF, Reveal.js. In YAML, indentation matters. YAML's kind of finicky. It's not my favorite. It's nice and readable, but it's pretty picky. So in this case, the key is format, and then the value for that is another key, so you can nest them, called HTML. And then within HTML, I have two more keys that now have values. And importantly, that nesting is done by adding two spaces. So like if you don't include a space after the colon, it's not going to be happy. If you don't indent, it's not going to be happy. And if you do this, like you don't tell it what the value is, it's not going to be happy. Spaces, yeah. Yeah. So there are multiple valid ways of doing this. Yeah, you can either put it on the same line, you can put it on the next line as long as you have that indentation, and then you can do the nesting as long as they follow the first two rules. And I should say that YAML exists across all sorts of different document types, and you can find documentation online that tells you all the rules about how your YAML needs to be formatted. You can also have YAML testers, like if you're running into bugs with your YAML, you can just Google YAML tester. There are pages where you can just paste your YAML into there and it'll indent it for you and fix all your problems. Right, so why do we use this if it's so finicky? Well, one is you can read it fairly easily because it is kind of nested hierarchically that way. And it's just better than doing this, right? Like you could say Quarto render document.qmd to HTML, but keep going. And I want to code fold. Oh, and I want to send some parameters to R, like alpha is going to be 0 and so on and so forth. And in fact, you can do this with our markdown files. Like if you neglect to include YAML header, you can always add extra stuff. Like there are different ways that you can send it the metadata, but this is a way where the metadata is actually bundled inside the document. So one thing that's nice about using, I think this works in Visual Studio, oh yeah, RStudio, Visual Studio, is there's some built-in linting, which is kind of like, it'll kind of help guide what you're doing here. So, you know, pay attention to like the messages that appear in RStudio as you're writing your YAML. They can be helpful. You can also, all throughout a Quarto document, there's all sorts of auto-completion that can be really helpful for learning what the options are. So either control space or not command space, control space will bring up all the different possible formats, for example. All right, so with that, you have Hello Penguins open. Please go ahead and try control spacing to see some valuable YAML options. Try out tab completion of any options that you remember. And if you have these slides up, you can click on this link and it will bring you to this documentation page. This is all of the different things that you can add to a document. They are extensive. These are all things that can live in your YAML. So I'll give you 3 minutes just to tinker around with YAML.